All right, we're jumping right into a really fascinating, an absolutely crucial decade in India's fight for independence. We're going to look at the early 1900s, a time when the struggle against the British Empire was really heating up, gaining a ton of momentum. But, and this is the big but, it was also starting to crack from the inside. We're talking deep fractures that would totally change the course of history. So let's get into it. How a movement on the rise began to tear itself apart.
When we think of a freedom struggle, we usually picture a completely united people against one big enemy, right? But here's the question that really sets up everything we're talking about today. What happens when the movement itself is divided? What if the biggest obstacle to freedom isn't the empire you're fighting, but the divisions within your own ranks? Because for India during this period, that was the absolute reality. Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we have to start with the main political force of the time, the Indian National Congress, or the INC. Think of it as the central nervous system, the absolute brain of the whole nationalist movement. This was the group speaking for millions.
And just take a look at this picture. On the surface, it looks like a picture of unity, doesn't it? You've got all these leaders gathered together, looking like they're all on the same page. But what you can't see behind those serious faces is that a massive storm was brewing. Deep ideological cracks were forming that were about to split the entire movement wide open. And listen, this wasn't just some minor disagreement. Not at all. This was a fundamental clash of philosophies. We're talking about two completely different ideas about how to win independence, and they were on a collision course that was going to define the next 10 years. And that collision? It happened in 1907. The place was the Indian National Congress session in Surat. This was the moment where those cracks we were talking about, well, they didn't just show. They absolutely shattered the whole facade of unity. And this slide lays out the two sides perfectly. On one side, you had the moderates. These guys believed in playing the long game, using petitions, dialogue, and slow constitutional reform. Their goal was self-rule, but, and this is really key, within the British system. Then you had the extremists. They were just done being patient. They demanded Swaraj, which means complete, total self-rule. And they were convinced that the only way to get it was through direct action, like boycotts and mass protests. So what was the final straw? What really tipped things over the edge? Well, it pretty much boiled down to two big triggers. First, a huge argument over the Swadeshi movement. That's the boycott of British goods. The extremists wanted to use it as a weapon all across India. The moderates, they got scared, thought it was too radical. And the second trigger was a good old-fashioned power struggle over who would be the president of the INC. Both sides knew that whoever controlled the party controlled the entire strategy. The tension just got way too high. And boom, the party split right down the middle.
Now, they did manage to patch things up years later, but the damage was done. The impact of the Surat split was profound. It exposed this major weakness right at the heart of the movement. It proved that the divisions were real, they were deep, and it signaled that the path to independence was going to be anything but a straight line. But all this drama within the Congress wasn't happening in a vacuum. As the INC was fracturing, another huge development was taking place. In 1906, a completely new political force entered the arena, one that would literally reshape the future of the subcontinent. And here they are. This is a really powerful photo of the founding members of the All India Muslim League. When it formed in 1906, it was a massive deal. It signaled the birth of a distinct, separate political voice for India's Muslim community, many of whom felt that their interests just weren't being represented by the Hindu-dominated Congress. And their goals were crystal clear right from the start. Founded by big names like the Aga Khan and Nawab Salimullah, its whole purpose was to promote and protect the political rights and interests of Indian Muslims. Now, it started off with a pretty moderate stance, but its formation was a pivotal moment that, decades down the road, would eventually lead to the demand for a separate nation entirely.
So let's recap. You've got a split nationalist movement and the rise of a new political party based on religious identity. So how did the British react to all this? Well, they reacted with a very clever two-part strategy: divide and appease. Now, to understand their strategy, you've got to get this one concept: separate electorates. It basically meant that in an election, only Muslims could vote for Muslim candidates. This created a political system built entirely around religious identity. It was a really controversial idea, and a lot of nationalists were worried it would permanently drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims. And they made this policy official with the Morley-Minto reforms in 1909. As you can see here, the reforms had two aims. On one hand, they tried to appease the moderates in the Congress by giving Indians a little more representation in government. But on the other hand, they introduced these separate electorates for Muslims.
A lot of people saw this as a classic divide and rule tactic, weaken the overall nationalist movement by making politics all about religion.
But the British strategy wasn't just about dividing people. Appeasement was also a huge part of the plan. To try and calm down all the fiery protests that had been going on for years, especially in Bengal, they decided to make a really massive concession.
So in 1911, they did a complete 180. They canceled the 1905 partition of Bengal. Now, this partition had been a huge source of anger and was basically the main fuel for the extremist movement. So by reuniting Bengal, the British hoped to cool things down and show that they were willing to listen. It was a pretty clever move to appease the very same groups they were also trying to divide.
So, as this decade came to a close, all these events, the internal splits, the new parties, the British strategies had completely rewritten the rules of the game.
Let's just do a quick recap of this whirlwind of a decade. 1906, the Muslim League is born. 1907, the Congress fractures. 1909, separate electorates are introduced, totally changing the political math. And 1911, the partition of Bengal gets reversed. I mean, every single one of those was a seismic shift.
So the really crucial takeaway here is this. The fight for independence was no longer a simple, unified movement. It had become this complex political stage with multiple actors, the moderates, the extremists, the Muslim League, and the British, all making their own moves with their own goals and strategies.
And that leaves us with one final big question. After a decade that introduced so many new divisions and complexities, was India actually any closer for freedom? Or had the path to independence just become infinitely more complicated? That's something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.